All right, we're going to get started. Everybody, thank you for joining us today. This is, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor McGarry and I teach constitutional law and some other stuff. This is a really, really great day for me because you get these rare opportunities in your career to do things as part of your job in a beautiful room that just feel like a total scam and boondoggle. And for me, this is like that because I get to welcome one of my oldest and dearest friends to WashU Law. I'm sitting here with Tom Boddern. Tom is the Secretary of the Minnesota Senate. He has had a very interesting life. He was born in Denmark, grew up for some of your early years in Kenya and Uganda, and then came to continued his exotic run by coming to Milwaukee in third grade, where he and I met, and we have been friends ever since. Tom went to Williams College, got his BA there, and then got his JD at the University of Wisconsin. He met his now wife, Kathy, in college. Kathy's from the Twin Cities. And so after law school, Tom headed up to the Twin Cities, clerked on the Minnesota Supreme Court, went to one of the premier law firms in town, and had the experience that many of us have at premier law firms. We're like, wow, this is a premier law firm. What else can I do? And so that took him into state government in Minnesota. He eventually became and served for some years as the chief counsel for the state Senate, and then received 2 years ago?
Just the beginning of this year.
Beginning of this year, became the Secretary of the Senate. So we're just going to talk up here for a while, and I will tell you up front, I'll tell you our master plan. There are really two things that we want to talk about and hopefully entertain you with. One is just the substance of the work that Tom does, which I think is really interesting for anybody who's interested in government and the workings of government from a lot of different angles. And the other thing, for those of you who are students, is that actually for many, as long as I've been teaching, I'll frequently talk about Tom when students come to me thinking about job possibilities and things they might do, because something that very few students think about, because I think very few of us professors talk about it, is state government as a career path. But it's a really, really interesting and appealing career path for all kinds of reasons. As we'll discuss, decent work-lifestyle balance, really interesting work, getting to really dig into some interesting areas. So hopefully part of what we'll get out of this conversation is conveying some of that appeal to all of you. So we'll just talk for a while, and then we'll open it up for questions about whatever you want to talk about.
And Greg, I think there are some important acknowledgments.
Oh yeah, thank you very much. Karen reminded me. For our event here today, we express our gratitude first to the Public Interest Law and Policy Speakers Series, which, whether you know it or not, is the auspices under which we are all here. We got a bunch of co-sponsors: the Wiedenbaum Center on the Economy, Government, and Public Policy, the Gephardt Institute for Civic and Community Engagement, and also the Political Science Department. So thanks to everybody for making this possible. So let's start out just talking a little bit about how you got to where you are. We were kicking this around a little bit last night. So you did your clerkship, you go to the firm, and what got you thinking about moving into state government? Like, where did that idea come from?
Well, first, Greg, I want to say thanks for inviting me in. This really is a treat as well. Absolutely want to acknowledge that. And it's I spend some time in Minnesota trying to make law students and other undergraduates that are available of employment opportunities in the legislature, and it's really great to be able to spread the word a little further maybe and get the chance to help others think about that as well. But thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I can't claim that I had a lot of foresight or intention about at least a career in the legislature. I certainly had an interest in public service. I knew that from some of the clinical work I did as a student at the University of Wisconsin Law School, just in the sense that I found the work really interesting and fulfilling. Certainly not as lucrative, but I had this in the back of my mind, and just basically got the discussion going with some of my colleagues, in the big law firm days, and through happenstance, a friend of a friend found out that there was an opening at the Office of Senate Counsel with the Minnesota Senate. And just to kind of carbon date this, it was a classified ad in the newspaper. So it was kind of a very retro version of the job search. But I started there, and I think, one thing I'll say about that, I remember practically wanting to pinch myself in the first few months I was working there. Like, I can't believe how fast-paced this is, interesting, exciting. I really like the other people I'm working with. And a year went by there in what felt like, maybe 10 big law firm years. Not to just continually hammer on that theme, but it was, I found the work just really interesting. And now, looking back on it, that was 1997, and it's gone by quickly.
So I want to sort of trace through the different stages of the work you've done for the Senate. So you start out in the counsel's office as the new guy. And as you're talking about that work and how interesting it was, like, what did they start you out doing?
Sure. And that actually is another great feature and a theme to emphasize here. It's safe to say that most offices, certainly in the Senate, are not overstaffed, so there's a lot of responsibility available really right away. I came in and served as the counsel for the Environment and Natural Resources Committee, which involved working on the legislation going through that committee, all the way from taking ideas that legislators had and turning them into bill drafts, kind of the cradle to grave process for the legislation, all the way through committee onto floor amendments for the floor debate on particular bills, including and especially the omnibus legislation that sort of establishes the budget for that area that's typically passed at the very end of the session. And then, down the line, one of the exciting features is the conference committee activity. Minnesota's a little bit different in that there are staff for each chamber that handle these functions, nonpartisan staff. Many other states are arranged differently. And then what that allows you to do as nonpartisan staff is really engage in, the Senate side of the conference committee discussion about, reaching that compromise on the omnibus bill. So the theme I'm trying to emphasize is that right away got thrown into drafting the legislation, having to understand it, drafting amendments really quickly, and trying to be as responsive as possible. Another component of that, since you have a law degree, people will look to you for answers on procedure. So right away, committee procedure became important, and it's a little less formal, but it's important to be consistent, to understand the basic principles, and I found I could be helpful almost immediately.
So I would think there would be a big learning curve with that stuff, because you've got this essentially a body of law, but it's a body of internal rules and then customs and practices of just how things get done, right?
There is a lot of learning by the seat of your pants and being thrown into situations where you don't have the answers. Luckily, it's an environment often where the answer, I don't know that, I'm going to follow up with you soon. That answer will fly in a lot of circumstances. I had the good fortune to work in an office, and I was, kind of mentioning this theme earlier. There were about 25 other attorneys and analysts in the office, and they're fantastic, very professional staff. Many of them, have really been doing this for the better part of their career. So they were a tremendous resource in educating me, helping me understand, those basic principles. And that's the other thing I'd say. If you have a good understanding of the principles, you can go a long way in helping translate that into a particular set of circumstances.
And I imagine you were alluding to this, but people probably stick around a long time for a lot of these folks, right?
I would say, right away when I started there, I noticed there were people who'd been, doing this kind of work for north of 30 years. And that's invaluable, not only as a resource for other staff in the office, but for the institution as well. There is, I forget what the cliche is, but, when the old becomes new, it can happen fairly frequently in the legislative process. And there is again, speaking broadly, thinking about the members and other staff, there is a wish, a thirst to understand, how was this handled the previous time we encountered these circumstances? What we want to be fair in the general sense, and consistent with that, and look to that circumstance for guidance. So I forget what your question was, and I meandered some from there, but I think that, the theme to hit on there is that the nonpartisan staff are, I don't want to overstate it, but kind of a backbone of the legislature in terms of providing that institutional knowledge over time, and there's a high value placed on that.
So there are a couple of things that you talked about that I want to go into a little bit more. You talked about being in the Senate counsel's office and drafting legislation, and I think this may be something that comes as a surprise to folks. We usually assume, if we're thinking about bills in legislatures, that, we have the naive assumption that the members themselves actually sit down and write stuff, which is probably not always the case. But then we might expect, well, okay, then maybe the legislators' partisan staff are writing stuff. But they actually come to you and say, okay, we want to implement, I want to propose this bill to implement this policy, and I want your help with that. And we'll go into this more too, but as you said a couple of times, you're nonpartisan staff. So what's that, how does that process work?
It can really work a lot of different ways. All the way from kind of what you're describing, where, member X says, I just had a great idea yesterday, come on over and let's chat about it, and we can put that into bill form. And I don't want to pretend, certainly at the other end, there are interest groups, lobbyists, and others who will really do a lot of drafting, and then you're presented, and in a lot of ways this is more challenging as nonpartisan staff. You're eventually brought into the loop. Okay, here's the draft. And you might have a number of different roles there, just mechanically speaking, making sure all the parts fit together. You're picking up the cross-references properly, looking for ambiguities in the way things are written, which are sometimes deliberate. So, on the one hand, there's a very open invitation, in some circumstances, just do what you think works best, all the way through, clean this up a little bit, and then get out of the way. Just, in the interest of full disclosure about how this works.
And so you're doing this for whoever asks, we were talking about this a little bit last night, but the party of the majority is going to have greater prospects for getting things enacted. So they're likely to be more active in proposing legislation, but a minority member might come to you as well and say, hey, I want to fall on this sword, so I'm going to propose this bill. But the subject matter range and the policy direction that you're working on, this could be anything. And without getting into particulars, you're like any other human being. You've got your political views and your policy views. So how do you sort of navigate that psychologically when someone says, hey, write this bill to do this thing, and in your head you're thinking, yeah, you're asking, the thing you're asking me to do is a policy that I disagree with if I'm talking about my personal politics. How do you think about that?
It can be challenging, and in fact, it's one of the standard interview questions that we have. And I think certainly in the first circumstance, at first glance, it's what I would call an institutionalist view of how this needs to work. And we need to make sure that our staff, have given every bill the best effort that we can in terms of making sure that it does what its author intends it to do. That's not unlike, in a very general sense, lawyers aren't always selecting their clients, and they're not always in agreement with what their clients are asking them to do. You're performing a professional function. So there's a level of professionalism you can bring to it. I would say it's also, here's another nuance to this. It's a way that you understand legislation and the arguments around it really well. As a thought exercise, 1 minute you're drafting a bill that has a very particular purpose, and perhaps the next day you're called on to draft an amendment that will undo it, or water it down, or significantly alter the direction that bill is going to take. So just from a purely intellectual point of view, I found it really interesting to engage with the legislation that way, and tended to think of it like that.
That's really, the analogy to lawyers and clients, I get that, but in that sense, it's different, because as a lawyer representing a client, at least you're on the same side all the time. You're having to okay, I wrote this thing 2 weeks ago, and now how do I mess with it? Do the members who come to you, does that sort of ever give them pause, or they're kind of asking you hey, you wrote this thing, where are the weak points?
There's a lot of, one thing I haven't talked about at all, but there is a confidentiality and trust are incredibly important to the work that the nonpartisan staff do, and it takes time to build that. So, kind of some of those requests and what is revealed to you about what's needed with a particular piece of legislation develops over time when a member or their staff realizes, Tom's done this work in the past, it's been done well, I'm gonna bring them a little closer to the full description of what it is we're trying to accomplish here. So it's nuanced. It's not it doesn't work this way every time, and sometimes you're given a very rudimentary description of what's needed, but you can develop that trust and confidence. And yeah, it is hard to hold in one hand a set of confidential discussions about intent, and on the other hand be responsive to someone asking you maybe more general questions about what a bill does, or does it really does it do what its author says it does? Those kinds of questions.
Yeah. So you're talking about being nonpartisan staff, and you've used the word institutionalist a couple of times, and there's all kinds of stuff I want to ask you about that. But so it is a sort of truism of the present political moment, and a truism that seems to have a lot of support behind it, that among legislators, certainly starting at the federal level in Congress, institutionalists among members of the body are a dying breed. That there used to be a lot stronger commitment by leaders within legislatures to institutionalism. So you've been doing this for a while. Have you seen a change in that regard in the state legislature that you work in? Is it more partisan, less institutionalist among the members who you're working with?
Undeniably, like every other public policy arena in the U.S., I think the Minnesota legislature has become more partisan. That's certainly, and that's in the sense of there are fewer moderates. Most members spend their time worrying about their next primary and not their next general election opponent. Those things are all happening there. I don't, I read the newspapers and see things about Congress, and I don't have a sense, and I had a few interactions with, like the parliamentarian for the U.S. House, that kind of thing, seen him talk. I don't have a really strong sense for kind of what goes on behind the scenes there, but what I'll say about my own experience is that there might be less of a willingness to take kind of the traditional route through the legislative process, that maybe hasn't been prescribed by the rules, but is the way the rules sort of were intended to operate, and it has become more obstreperous. But that's a little bit different, that in a way it's using the rules to make things more challenging. That's, to me, there's still an institutional value within that, and I would say that most, so many members and of all stripes have an interest in trying to understand exactly what it is the rules do require, and they want to follow that. And in the end, this is in their self-interest. It's an easier route to take if they can demonstrate this. They're not undone as quickly. But yeah, undeniably, there are a lot of tensions surrounding the process, and I would say, what makes this challenging is a deeper examination of what some of these rules that haven't always been implemented mean. If that makes sense, it's a little abstract, but really being called upon, for example, and I'm trying to avoid the inside baseball terms as much, but when a bill is reported from committee, the Senate adopts the committee report. This is just one example. That, for decades, had been seen as kind of a ministerial function. Okay, we're acknowledging the receipt of this report from a committee, and then we'll take it up the next day. Well, members in the minority decided to challenge that, and it slowed everything down. There was a way to deal with it, but it just took more time.
And so, and this goes what you were saying, like they're very concerned with understanding the rules, but now they want to use the rules in a more aggressive or combative way in certain circumstances. Do you feel like, so I would, correct me if I'm wrong, what I'm getting in part from that is the members are still coming to you with respect and appreciation for what you and the people you work with, the nonpartisan staff, bring to the table.
That's something I would say. I mean, it's like, tooting my own horn, but I really think, in the very broad sense, bipartisan sense, there is a lot of gratitude for the work directly from the members for the work that the nonpartisan staff do. They respect and appreciate that. We provide them a resource, and ultimately, in the end, we're a resource they can use to accomplish what they got elected to do. So, and they understand that. I think that's still true.
Right. And so I want to go back a little bit to the timeline of your career. So how long were you in the Senate counsel's office all told?
I started there in 1997 and then became the director and kind of, you gave it the best description possible. Serving as counsel to the Rules Committee is kind of like being the general counsel or the chief counsel for the Senate. I began that role in 2011.
Okay. And so what, talk a little bit about that, like what changed, what about your day-to-day routine and sort of what you were doing in the job when you took over. This is sort of a classic story, I think, that in a lot of employment settings of you stick around and you're good at what you do and you've got a skill set and then they make you be in charge of stuff. And that can be a mixed bag, I would think.
Right, and there's a set of the responsibilities you're talking about that relate more to kind of the management of litigation that might affect the body, kind of that general counsel role. Those are more substantive. Certainly managing people was something altogether new and different, but it involved thinking a lot about the core values we had as an office. A little bit of a story about that point in time in the Minnesota legislature. The Senate had been controlled by Democrats since it had become partisan in the early 70s. So it was about a 38-year run that ended in the 2010 election of exclusively Democratic control. This was a sea change in how the institution operated. And really, in a lot of ways, because it was a chamber that hadn't flipped back and forth up to that point, it was ill-prepared to handle a change in majority. It just wasn't something we went through frequently. For example, members of the new majority had no experience chairing committees to speak of, really, so they needed to be trained. But more fundamentally, and this gets back to the trust element, members of the new majority, and I'll choose my words a little bit carefully here, had to reevaluate their relationship with our office. What they were giving us was now more likely to become law. The nature of the work just became much more sensitive. So there was a period of time there where we went back into building trust. I will say what helped a lot with that were several lawsuits involving the legislature where they needed assistance. Really, institutionally, as I said before, the resources are not vast. So they were looking for help everywhere they could get it and needed to understand what the significance of these lawsuits was, what the potential consequences would be, where they could find, outside resources. Specifically, I'm thinking of, there were two major lawsuits. One of the first was resulted from a shutdown of government. There was failure to enact the budget legislation at the end of the fiscal year. And the governor, the Democratic governor, sued in court to seek court funding for the operations of state government. So this was a watershed moment in terms of what the state constitution required. Did the Senate want to intervene? All of those fundamental questions.
Was this Governor Dayton?
Yes. Okay, so his first year on the job.
Because you were telling me a different story last night where it got flipped, right? Talk about that one.
He kept things busy some years down the line, and there's a complicated interplay on the passage of budget bills and what those contained, but he realized he had kind of been cornered, maybe would be a good way to put it, through some legislation that he'd agreed to and had one bill left to sign that he used his line item veto to pull a lever on. He line item vetoed the entire budget for the legislature. So he turned off the lights. And at that point, litigation was again required, seeking some kind of assistance from the courts. In a nutshell, the Senate prevailed in the Ramsey County District Court and provided an order for continued funding. Eventually, after many months and a lot of contortions, the Minnesota Supreme Court reversed that order, but through what I'll call sort of a form of discovery, ascertained that there were enough funds to float the legislature through to the next session. There were, again, not wanting to go into too many details, but much of the back and forth in that litigation involved, what are the reserve funds available to the legislature? What are the essential functions of the legislature? How long do you need to continue those? So there was a real, that was an existential crisis, yes.
I bet. I mean, and I just kind of love this, that at one point, the governor has to sue the legislature to keep the legislature running, and at another point, the legislature has to sue the governor to keep the legislature running. And this is a state renowned for good government by the standards of the United States. So, like, that's a trip.
It was a great opportunity to explore, just in the broader intellectual sense, what are the limits of the line item veto authority?
Oh, yeah.
How far does it extend?
Just some of my legislation students know this, but in Wisconsin, the line item veto is so crazy, the governor can literally strike the word "not" from a bill. I think our governor last year extended school funding for, I think, centuries by adding some zeros.
400 years.
Yeah, it was a whole, I mean, that's some policy entrepreneurship right there.
The thing I think about with that is that it's got to make negotiations incredibly complicated.
Yeah.
Will you provide your assurance that you won't, use your veto authority, and just the words have to be chosen exceptionally carefully, and everything confined, and a lot of trust on top of that.
Well, yeah, as you say, within the legislature, you can't really negotiate without knowing what the governor is doing, because there's not, even if you trust the folks across the aisle from you in the legislature, they're not your problem. The governor is potentially your problem.
All budget negotiations, as long as I can remember, are in a room, what I'll call the behind-the-scenes part, that includes the governor and the leaders of each body. There's just no other way to make it happen.
All right, so you took over, and I didn't realize the timing of that you took over running the counsel's office right at the moment of that partisan shift.
That's correct.
That's insane.
Yeah,
that must have been really hard.
Well, okay, I want to correct myself. I took on that kind of general counsel role for a year, and then the previous director resigned about a year following.
Okay.
So yeah, it was a sequence of events. But what I will say is the opportunity to serve as general counsel helped in the director function as well. Again, just the trust building component.
Yeah, that in that respect, it's good timing. But it's kind of crazy that you came, you started there, by the time you got there, it had already been Democratic controlled for a long time. The Republicans had gotten used to, I'm sure, just playing minority party games. And then, as your career is sort of maturing, suddenly they have to learn to be in charge.
Right.
Institution.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, all right, let's talk about the job you've got now as Secretary of the Senate. What is that? What does the Secretary of the Senate do?
I'm still working. It's been almost a year now, and you'd think I'd have the short description nailed down a little better. But there are two principal functions. The Secretary of the Senate serves as the parliamentarian and all of the associated functions that go along with that for the Senate itself. So when it's in session, the Secretary and the Secretary's staff basically are responsible for keeping all of it on track. Which bills are properly before the Senate, what's been reported from committee, tracking all of the activity that occurs with this and recording that in the Senate Journal. That's a really important constitutional obligation. Preparing messages that are sent to the other body, notifying the president and others when messages are received from the House. There's a lot of, the control of the flow of legislation, and we're relied on heavily for that. The other component of that is serving as a parliamentarian. So when points of order are raised on the floor, I'm a principal resource for the Senate president, who will ultimately rule on that point of order. And there's usually sometimes it's 10 seconds, sometimes it's half an hour, kind of sidebar conversation that I'll have with the Senate president during some of the more complicated points of order. And that's where the background and the history with legislative procedure are really invaluable in this new role. The second component of it is serving as the chief administrative officer for the Senate. So managing the Senate budget, supervising all the nonpartisan staff, all those functions you think of like HR and IT. I was thinking a little bit this morning and actually have to hire a new director for Senate Media Services, which is the name given basically to our broadcast function. Minnesota does a really outstanding job televising practically all legislative proceedings. It's incredibly expensive. They just went through a new round of funding for all the cameras required to do this and the software and equipment related to that, about $20 million for 7 years worth of equipment. So the transparency function, and I'm kind of linking it back to this institutional value of transparency and public expectations for visibility, only increase over time. I mean, that's sort of something I would observe. There's a tremendous demand for that. So that's a really important function that the Senate has that's just, grown enormously in the last 20 to 30 years.
I know this is going to be hard to have a context for, but do you think that transparency and the ability of ordinary people to see the legislature in action, do you get a sense that affects how legislators conduct themselves?
For sure. The specific example I can think of is, there's a divided legislature, let's say a Republican House and a Democrat-controlled Senate. And there are contentious negotiations on the structure of the state budget, and an agreement is reached that involves a lot of compromise for a budget package that's acceptable to both parties. The window of time to get that enacted has shrunk because of the visibility that it's now possible. If you compare it to, when I started in 1997, the word just spread more slowly.
Okay.
But now, I guess it's a whole variety of sort of mass communication tools mean that there is just the pressure to do this all very rapidly has increased enormously.
So if activists of whatever political stripe want to sort of get people worked up about a feature of the compromise legislation, that can happen fast.
That's it in plain English, yeah. So it just makes that whole stage of the process, you have to finalize it and put it in the can as quickly as possible.
That's, I had some in mind I wanted to ask you, and I lost it. I remember now. Correct. Tell me if any of this is wrong, because it's important if this is wrong. But my recollection from earlier this year is when you were appointed to this position, you were appointed by a new was the Senate President make this decision, or?
So it's sort of a two-step process. The Senate President worked together with the new Senate Majority Leader.
Okay.
And I met with them. We discussed, what my interest in it, what that would look like, and then really what they do is nominate me as an officer of the Senate. And the Senate, I'm an elected officer of the Senate, to be really precise about it.
And so the new majority, the Democrats took over control, right? Am I
Correct.
Right? So
it flipped this year.
New Democratic Majority Leader, and so what I'm trying to ask this delicately.
Sure.
I have to be delicate with you.
Well, yeah.
But you built this whole career and the whole sort of understanding of the public service you're doing as a nonpartisan staff member, and now here's this somewhat, at least to an outside observer, somewhat partisan dimension to your getting this position. The new Democratic leader says this is the guy I want. And I'm curious about sort of both the inputs and the outputs of that. Like, is there friction around that decision? You're a known quantity. Obviously, people know you because you've been in the counsel's office at this point for a long time.
I mean, this has to be handled delicately, that whole transition. I'll say that the previous secretary resigned, and it's kind of about the discussion and consultation that go into a decision like that, to nominate me. It was very important to me before any of this became public. After talking to the majority leader and the president, one of the first calls I wanted to make in discussions was with the new incoming Senate minority leader. And, maybe not necessarily extending veto power, but very clearly inviting, comment and discussion. And that was a conversation that went well. So,
okay.
Long story short, and I take pride in that, the 67 members of the 67-member Senate voted for me. I want to keep it that way.
Yeah.
That's about trust. And really, fundamentally, and more importantly than that, I think in the future, if this role can change into a role that will survive a change, where the occupant can survive a change in majority without.
So I was going to ask you about this.
Sure.
In the past, has it been fairly common for there to be, when there's a change in partisan control of the Senate, a new secretary?
Yes, right. It has. That's the simple way of saying it. I mean, it's a little bit nuanced, but a previous secretary, for example, at one point had been and that's going back years, but had been the Democratic candidate for one of the congressional districts
Okay.
before. So this varies a lot, and this is like another larger theme we probably don't have time to go into, but one of the really exciting things about working in a state legislature is there are all these other state legislatures out there. There are colleagues in other states. There are people you can look to for guidance on how to approach some new situation, maybe helping you think more deeply about a particular problem. So to your point, in many states, it is seen as a partisan position, although the occupant might term themselves nonpartisan. And there are some other states where it truly has been, and I think will remain that way, as a nonpartisan position.
And so you're kind of low-key wanting to change the paradigm a little bit, or at least continue or accelerate the shift in paradigm.
That is, kind of a long-range goal, something I'd like to try to accomplish.
In a minute, I want to just open it up to questions, but I want to ask you one more thing, just kind of shifting back to the career path side. How have you liked your life doing all of this?
Well, I was saying this earlier. It's intellectually, I think, really stimulating. It's always been very absorbing. I really like the people I work with, and that's in the broader sense. I, kind of talked about the office itself, where I worked previously. The nonpartisan staff really throughout the Senate are wonderful. It's fun to work with them. But beyond that, and I'm not saying I love them all and they're all, really great people. It's great to get to know the members a little bit. And I think one thing that I've developed a healthy amount of respect for is the sacrifices that people make to serve, particularly in a state legislature. And this is, I've, again, all stripes, persuasions, whatever you want to call it. There are some incredibly hardworking people. It takes a ton of time. And sure, there are reasons why people might do it. It's really gratifying, or they have a big ego, or that kind of thing. But there's just a lot that goes into it, and respect I have for those who really take the time to serve their constituents is, that's only grown over the years. So this is really going off on a sidetrack from how I like my life. But the one thing I'll say about all of this is that state legislatures are very, very seasonal. So this is kind of tying it back into the theme of, a career there. It's not for everybody. The hours, in particular during the later stages of a legislative session, they're pretty brutal. One of the worst stretches I recall recently was about 3 days straight, meaning, around the clock, in this situation of, putting bills into the can and getting them enacted after a deal is reached. Nobody in the whole place went home for several days running, and people were really drained and exhausted. But more important than simply being tired is, that can be very demanding for family life, and requires some sacrifices.
But it kind of ebbs and flows with the session, right? That you're, when it's hot and heavy when the session is going and coming down to the wire with some of those things, and then when the session ends, you can catch up, I imagine, on some other things.
Things become very quiet. There's a lot of catching up on, the accumulated compensatory time and vacation. So that's not for everybody either. Some people just like to be busy consistently, and I would say certainly in the management and leadership roles, I've remained consistently busy. That hasn't been a problem, but I'm just thinking about staff generally. It works really well for people, if you want to take a 3-week vacation in the fall when they're not in session, that's something that's very attainable. So there's a real upside to that. And again, legislatures vary widely. The calendar can be very different in some states. And there are some that are full-time, but even there, they're taking often longer breaks.
Gotcha. All right, well, anybody has any questions about any of this at all? Yeah, start here.
Stand up if you would.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, good here.
In a more partisan environment, how would someone who's just getting into this develop the same sort of trust within the electorate or within the legislature that you were able to build over such a long career?
Well, certainly, this is another thing that can be really frustrating about it. Folks who are hired to work in the nonpartisan offices, there are some things that won't fly in the way of experience that that might be on their resume. If you managed a senator's campaign, you're not going to get hired to work in a nonpartisan office. So it's sort of what you bring there. And in the age of social media, all of this is increasingly transparent. So if it's clear that maybe setting aside, I don't know, membership in a college organization or something like that, somebody is basically relatively nonpartisan. What I would say about the office I used to work in is there's a real trust in the entire office and a willingness to extend that to folks who are newer in the office, and then you accumulate it over time. It's a great question, and yeah, it's kind of like layers, but I would say for folks starting there, they get off on a pretty good foot, again, just given the way that things are structured and the confidence in the office.
Saw some questions over here, yeah.
Hi, so I'm affiliated with a nonprofit organization called Nonpartisan Nebraska, which for those of you who don't know, the Nebraska state legislature is officially nonpartisan. That is, members of the legislature, when elected and when campaigning, are not affiliated with a political party. But there is obviously some factionalism, some coalition activity within the legislature. And in the last decade or so, it's become more fractured or frayed. Given your experience, not as a legislator, but as a nonpartisan member of a legislative body, what sort of guidance would you give, or would you be willing to give, to an organization such as myself that is dedicated to preserving maybe this idea of integrity that a nonpartisan label carries for legislation and for deliberation?
It's really interesting to pick apart this word nonpartisan. What does it mean? Certainly in terms of the staff function, really, my office and the nonpartisan staff are not advocates for any form of policy. I'm guessing your organization is, maybe one word for it, even though I understand Nebraska is nonpartisan, is bipartisan, where you're perhaps finding and emphasizing policy changes that you think there would be broad agreement on. And that's just where, you're headed in a slightly, I don't know that my experience is directly relevant to that, but what I could say is if you're being real careful about building that bipartisan support, that's a step at a time, and again, just all the basics about trust building, not overreaching, and really, it's slow, it's ponderous, it takes time. You also, I love, as I was mentioning earlier, state legislatures are all different. The spectacular thing about Nebraska is it is the only legislature in the U.S. that's unicameral. This was 1930s, I think, is when it was changed. And that was an effort to, it was seen as, it's something like term limits, like we'll get rid of the evils of compromise. When the House and the Senate have to agree on something, it's going to be a more pure process. I think that was, some of the thinking behind it, but evidently it's popular. I mean, it stayed that way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for coming. What kind of work did you do when you were in private practice, and how do you find that translated into your career in state government?
Thanks. Yeah, it's funny. Greg and I were flashing back to that, and it was a while ago. I arrived at one of the larger law firms in Minneapolis, Faegre and Benson, in the early 90s, and entered their general litigation group, which was this very sort of bland name given to primarily insurance defense and product liability defense work. It was incredibly challenging. At that point in time, they were going through a real transition. Insurance companies weren't just paying the bills for lawyers the way they had for years. So there were a lot of people in that group kind of thinking about what their future was going to look like. But one thing it did do was give me some confidence, and I was fortunate to have, at that time, it wasn't impossible to get trial experience and a lot of deposition experience. All of that helped a lot with my confidence when I took on, several years later, the general counsel role, and just being able to help members understand what stages in litigation would look like, and be able to speak to it with some confidence. And I made a few contacts in the legal community that helped me find some of the outside resources they needed. So it became useful and helpful. I went through a period of time thinking it was completely irrelevant, but then it kind of came around a little bit later.
Yeah.
In the nonpartisan office, who has the power to hire and fire? Who's the boss?
Sure, yeah. So the director of that office takes care of the hiring. You could think of circumstances where someone steps over a line, and maybe engages in partisan activity. Ultimately, in the Senate, the way it's structured, certainly the Rules Committee would have the authority, to meet and discipline or discharge any employee. So there are ways it could be handled outside that process. And I think what that does is sort of shape how the director would have to approach it. You have a careful ear tuned into what both caucuses are saying about the work that employees are doing. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah.
Yes, you slightly alluded to sources of proposed bills being drafted from outside lobbyist groups. And what's that national government? ALEC?
Sure.
With its clear extreme bend agenda, with CAN legislation being provided across the United States, how many places like this have typically descend upon your legislature?
So just kind of restating the question, do we see a high volume of bills that originated with kind of an ALEC proposal? Would that be sort of,
Or any?
yeah.
Outside.
Any outside groups. And I would say, I've got to caveat the answer a little bit in that I'm now, a few years removed from a lot of the bill drafting work, so this may have changed more recently. It's hard to put percentages and numbers on that and would vary a lot by area. For example, in the election law area, there might be a lot of proposals that were initiated with national organizations. But ALEC is one organization that comes to mind when we think about bills that are pretty clearly identified elsewhere. There's a fair amount of it. I mean, it looks like you want me to clarify something?
Yes, are these lobbyist groups, are they balanced? I mean, is ALEC reigning supreme?
Are they different ideologically, you mean like different sides of the spectrum?
That's harder to comment on, and I know this sounds a little wishy-washy in terms of like the overall volume and the amount of resources being brought to bear on it. Certainly, ALEC has a lot of resources, so we'd see a fair amount of that. But I can't name a particular group that I think would dominate, the preparation of legislation.
In your legislature, does it have term limits?
Yeah, great and related question. And this is one thing where I really need to watch my words. In theory, I don't know that it's a partisan issue, although maybe lately it is. No, in a word. And
The question was about term limits.
Yeah.
Does the legislature term limit?
no term limits, and I think what I will say is that it can be invaluable working with some members who've been in the chamber a long time.
Let me ask you, does your legislature primarily receive the drafting through your office, your former office?
I would say the fair answer to that is yes. Yes, yeah, it begins.
Oh,
So there are three ways you can get bills drafted that would be introduced in the Minnesota legislature. There is the Office of Senate Counsel Research and Fiscal Analysis. There's what's called the Revisor's Office, which serves both bodies. And then there's a counterpart office that works for the House. Those are all nonpartisan offices. And ultimately, any bill that's introduced has to go through the Revisor's Office. But I would say there's a large majority of what I would call the in-depth legislation, where it's going to be more than several pages in length. Almost all of that is through kind of a back and forth process, meetings with groups privately to develop it. It rarely is introduced in whole cloth, as some group sent it to the legislature. I think that might be helpful.
You wanted to?
Unfortunately, as you all know, we have to end at 12:52 because some of you have classes. A comment and then a question. In relation to the last inquiry, I would say Russ Feingold was here recently, and I think he would say there is no such thing as nonpartisan in the world, that it just doesn't exist, and that money drives lobbyists, and lobbyists then drive legislation. So that's a discussion for a later time. Kudos to you all for having nonpartisan.
And I'll just jump in real quick on that. So one way I distinguish it is those offices, the ones I've referred to and worked in, are not policy advocates. They don't propose anything.
Yeah.
They're, they assist.
That's just,
Yeah.
But my question to you, which I think may be interesting to students, is so what kinds of courses should students consider if they think they might want to go into this world of legislative practice at any level, municipal, state, or federal? What kind of courses? And maybe that's a question for both of you. There are a few courses like the DC clinic that we have, the congressional clinic, lots of students take advantage of that. There's a course in the Brown School, state level lobbying, which I think gets into the, but courses, suggestions, particularly even substantive courses that
Maybe
you really ought to consider.
frame it a slightly different way. When you were hiring people in the counsel's office, like what, to whatever extent you thought about what they had done in law school, what they knew, like what was important?
I think taking a course like legislation would be really helpful as a marker of interest in the process, but really what we were looking for was, bright, all the basics, bright, capable people who could write really well, who demonstrated an interest in the legislative process. And there are a lot of ways you could do that. Might be, we offer a clerkship, or I say we, my former office offers a clerkship for part-time during the session for 2 law students. Opportunities like that. Certainly, engaging in any way with, and this is the tricky part with the nonpartisan side of it, that would suggest you really have an interest in the legislature itself. Undergraduate degrees in political science were always sort of persuasive that way. But there's no magic formula that way, and if there are a way to demonstrate some kind of involvement at some level. I do want to put the plug in too. I brought some cards with me, and if you want to come up and talk later, I'd love to do that. I really would like to engage on that. The other thing I want to mention is an organization called the National Conference of State Legislatures. They have a jobs board. You can look there, and particularly if you have mobility, it could be kind of intriguing. I've seen things like, the Legislative Council in American Samoa needs a new drafter, all the way, from A to Z, and a lot of exciting opportunities that way. So.
All right, so we got to end. Thank you all. Tom, thank you for being here. And if you did have a question you didn't get to, I think we can mill around here for
Absolutely.
a little bit to chat, so feel free.